pain. The ways are as countless as the multiplicity of natures and interests that flow from them. So I will use and apologize for a barbarous neologism to express this concept, negative mattering. I searched a lot for a nicer word, but that's the best I could come up with. Negative mattering means all actions or events that harm animals, from frightening them to removing the young unnaturally early, to keep it so it's unable to move and or socialize. Have any of you been in pig barns? Confinement pig barns? I mean, those animals are not feeling physical pain, at least initially, but it doesn't take Conrad Lorenz to know that they're miserable. And eventually they do suffer physical pain, arthritic lesions, pressure sores, etc., etc. Physical pain is perhaps the paradigmatic case of negative mattering, but only constitute a small part of what the concept covers. Positive mattering would, of course, encompass all states that are positive for the animal. Freedom of movement, pleasure, a sense of security, and so on. And although I never, ever, ever make predictions, because only an idiot makes predictions, if the CIA, which had a camera that could see the cigarette packs in the blouses of Russian soldiers, could not predict the downfall of the Soviet Union, I'm not going to predict anything. But I will say probably that if we continue in the direction society has been moving, there will eventually be an emphasis on keeping the animals happy, not only suffering neutral. I think that's already going on. If our analysis is correct, it is morally obligatory to expand the scope of veterinary medicine and or animal welfare science to study all of the ways that things can matter negatively to animals and how to alleviate them. In addition, it is necessary to understand which forms of negative mattering are most problematic from an animal's perspective. For example, Ron Kilgore, who was a New Zealand ethologist, showed that if you measure the stress hormones in cattle, exposure to new conspecifics causes a far more significant stress reaction for a longer time than does electric shock, which means that probably the animal would prefer to be shocked, which is actually testable, rather than to be introduced into a new herd. The fact that coyotes will chew their legs off in order, and I actually checked this out, and it does happen. Wildlife people told me, not only coyotes, but muskrats and other animals will chew their legs off to escape a trap, attests to the fact that immobilization is more aversive to a coyote than is significant pain. And that makes sense, because coyotes are both predators and prey, and they have to be able to move around. Obviously, the challenge is to study these sorts of modalities without causing great animal suffering. You guys familiar with learned helplessness studies? That's a really good example of something that's pretty wretched, to the point that it's been illegal in Britain for a significant amount of time. Any of you not familiar? Basically, you subject an animal to inescapable electric shock, whatever it does, and eventually it will curl into a fetal position and stop moving. Do nothing, because it's learned that whatever it does, it's going to get hurt. It's ironic that this, which I think was absurdly alleged to be a model for human depression, which I think is truly moronic. And my son, the psychiatrist, also. I mean, the complexity of human depression is hardly captured by an electric shock, whatever you do, you know? Ironically, in virtue of this research, which probably has had no significant use, the one exception is to give us some insight into probably what happens to animals in high confinement agriculture. They eventually give up in that same sort of state. Also necessary to study is the way in which the quality of negative experiences modulate the animal's cognitive and mental state, modulate the degree to which the animal experiences the event in question as negative. You guys know John Mason's work? Mason was a psychiatrist for the VA. In the early 70s, he did research on raising the temperature for mice beyond the thermoneutral, even and beyond the comfort zone. And then studying the stress response. For a long time it had believed, at least in animal science, that the stress response was a non-specific on or off. What Mason showed was that the stress response to the same stimulus depends on what it hurt him to say this, and he said so, depends on the animal's cognitive state. If the animal gets warning that the temperature is rising, it has way less a stress response than if it's suddenly afflicted with it. Okay? And this was a time in the early 70s where it was really non-kosher to say that an animal knows anything or has thoughts or anticipates. And that's not dead yet. That's what I've written a bunch about, at least 2 books, called Scientific Ideology. You know the work of Jay Weiss at Rockefeller? Similarly, very similar to Mason in some ways. The executive monkeys, maybe you know it under that title, that if you give the animals an electric shock at random, he sort of restrained them behind the desk, much as executives are. And if you shock them at random, there's a huge stress response every time. But if every shock is portended by a little bell going off, the stress reaction drops precipitously. So again, it's a matter of cognition. There's a wonderful example of the fact that some really smart researchers will reward animals with regard to negative procedures rather than fight them, force them, etc. We had a project at CSU, which was a parvovirus project, involved drawing blood. This lady would go every day to the animals, and she'd play with each dog and wrestle with them, take the blood and give them a treat. On one occasion, as she was leaving, one dog set up that kind of howl of a dog in agony. Yeah. She was sure that she'd closed the cage on his foot. When she went back, he started wagging his tail and stopped the ki-yi-yi. She checked her notes and she had not drawn the blood. And he was upset because he didn't get his play and he didn't get his treat. Larry Summer at Pennsylvania used to teach dogs to swallow balloons rather than try to force them to swallow balloons. He used reward. So it follows from what I've argued that all aspects of negative mattering should enter into the field of pain control. Nonetheless, physical pain has been called the worst of all evils. Have you read that book by an anesthesiologist? History of Pain Control. Great book. At first blush, this appellation seems wrong since we're inclined to believe that death is the worst of evils. Right? Intuitively? No? Yes? Maybe? Okay. Careful reflection, however, reveals the falsity of such assertions. Even among humans, people will choose death over prolonged and intense physical pain, and even over emotional pain, right? Assisted suicide, loss of dignity, all those sorts of things. Many people choose death over helplessness, or total dependence on others, or loss of dignity through incontinence, and so forth. While there are many cases, such as radical cancer treatment, where people undergo prolonged and horrible pain in order to live, there are also very many where death is chosen to forestall suffering. My kid's a board-certified psychiatrist, and one of the most profound experience he had in his medical training was a Vietnam vet who'd come in with a fall and some abrasions, and they determined that he had a kind of cancer. And he said, "I know." Well, are you being treated? He said no. At least by Colorado law, I don't know if it's the case here, if a person refused treatment for a terminal disease, then you have to get a psychiatric opinion. Is that the case? Well, it's the case in Colorado, and it fell to my son to interview this guy and decide essentially whether to let him die or not. And he called me up and he said, "Daddy, he's not crazy. He was a medic and he knows what that treatment entails. and he feels he's ready to die in a rational way. So who am I to say no? You know? That's why he gets the big bucks, the bastard. Since our topic is animal pain, the question arises as to how animals value death as compared to pain. This is an increasingly important conceptual ethical question where huge amounts of highly invasive therapy are being exported from human medicine to animal medicine, resulting in fair amounts of suffering. This is particularly true in oncology for pets, where cost has become less and less of an obstacle to applying all human treatment modalities to sick animals. There are a number of vet schools that have particle accelerators. As early as 1982, CSU, the Wall Street Journal, reported that people were spending over 6 figures on canine oncology at CSU. The question arises from the animal's perspective, is the chance of extra life worth a significant additional suffering? This leads to an ancillary question. Can the animal value life per se? To answer this question, I'd like to point up some conceptual differences between animal and human cognition. Human cognition is such that it can value long-term future goals and endure short-term negative experiences for the sake of achieving them. Examples are plentiful. Nobody would do a PhD if that weren't the case. You got some doctoral students in here? Okay, you guys know what I'm talking about. We undergo voluntary food restriction, the unpleasant experience for the sake of lowering blood pressure or looking good in a bathing suit as summer approaches. We